Hi, so we're live. My name is Philip Martin, and I am the co-owner of Philip Martin Gallery with my wife, Portia Hine. And I'm delighted to be talking here today with Sky Glabush. It usually takes just a minute or so for people to come into the conversation. So we'll just give people a second here to come in and organize themselves. I can see we've got a lot of people coming in, which is great, and from all over the world, which is really nice. So again, my name is Philip Martin. I'm the co-owner of Philip Martin Gallery with my wife, Portia Hine, who you might have met at the fairs or in the gallery. I'm delighted today to be speaking here with Sky Glabush. This is part of a series of conversations that we've been doing with gallery artists during the COVID crisis. And it's been really pretty exciting to connect with people and to talk with people. And I will say that one of the things that I didn't expect from this time was a kind of commitment and new thinking about art and what it can do. And we're really excited to be able to announce that we're representing Sky and that we're going to be doing a show with him in January. So how are you doing today, Sky?
I'm doing great.
Good.
Yeah.
So this is a conversation I've been looking forward to for a long time. Obviously, you can see that I have a painting behind me. Portia and I, like a lot of people, discovered Sky's work in Miami this last year and just have been totally obsessed with it. So this is a conversation I'm really eager to start. Here's just a sort of shot of Sky with a few of his different works. You can see that he works in painting, he works in sculpture, he works in textiles. Sky, talk to me just a little bit about your practice and these different objects that you make.
Okay. It's hard to know exactly where to start, but I'll go sort of to the beginning. I grew up in alternating between British Columbia, the West Coast, where my mom was, and the prairies, Saskatchewan in Canada, where my dad was, and I kind of shuttled back and forth between those two kind of environments growing up. And then so I did my undergraduate studies in Saskatchewan, in a town that I grew up in called Saskatoon. And after I graduated, I moved to Amsterdam, where my wife, who's a lawyer, she was hired there she specializes in tax law. So it was an international tax sort of tribunal that she was an editor, and she still works for that same company. Anyway, so we moved to Amsterdam, and then it was there that I had been doing. I had been really quite immersed in abstract painting, a kind of a gestural process-based. Think of artists like Ross Bleckner or Philip Taff, or sort of this. I came to my own in the 90s. So I was doing this kind of abstraction when I was there in Amsterdam, and then I moved and I started to think about the environment around me, and I started painting apartment buildings around Amsterdam that had this kind of modernist, hard sort of style kind of ethos about them. I started with collages, and then I started making these large scale paintings of apartments. Anyway, so when I came back to Canada, I started looking at architecture in relation to sort of vernacular, sort of like low-rise apartments, or a little bit like someone like Ed Ruscha in a way, actually, where it's sort of like looking at a kind of vernacular equivalent to sort of modernist aesthetics. Anyway, that developed into a kind of a way of thinking about abstraction that wasn't, for example, just totally process-based, but was kind of embedded in a larger social history. And in this case, it was the relationship between social design and aesthetics, and the way social design kind of, impinged on, when I saw the large-scale urban housing complexes in cities like Paris and Amsterdam and Rotterdam, they were actually quite oppressive spaces, even though the ethos that generated them was this sort of spirituality and openness and the universality of modernism. So anyway, that was how I began. And if you look at some of the work that you just that you just showed, like the textiles in relation to the sculpture. It's a kind of a continuation of that exploration of modernist aesthetics within a kind of social or sort of reimagining things historically.
So obviously you touched on a ton of interesting things there to kind of dive into. Um, with regard to sort of social design and aesthetics and different kinds of objects. And of course, here we can see some sculptures, we can see a textile behind you, we can see the portrait, and I of course we're just looking at a landscape. We have one of those in our show and we're gonna be working on those. Could you tell us just a little bit more, or it sounds like two things. Number one, living in Europe and encountering artists of other traditions and spending a lot of time with their work firsthand, but also being in an urban environment when it sounds like you spent a lot of time in more of a rural environment, or at least a landscape more dominated. Well, I guess BC and Saskatchewan are different kinds of environments, but I gravitate to this because I'm from Indiana originally, which is not as flat as people think it is, but it has some very flat parts, but you know, it is a very rural place. And of course, live in Los Angeles now and moving between an urban space and a rural space. So can you just elaborate a little bit more on, I don't know, those kinds of topics?
Sure. Well, Saskatchewan is absolutely flat. Where I was the archetypal kind of prairie landscape and very, very cold. So you're right. Moving from there to Amsterdam was definitely kind of a rude awakening in terms of the urban space of that city. But really, my interest was less in sort of the kind of geopolitical dimension, but more in like coming out of the prairies. There was this rich history of abstraction actually where I was from, because there's
Mhm.
this thing you may never hear of it, but in Canada you hear of it, called Emma Lake. And it
Mhm.
was this little workshop where artists like Barnett Newman and Anthony Caro and Stanley Boxer and Frank Stella, Clement Greenberg, all these high modernist sort of uh, celebrities in a way would come to this little regional workshop in the summers, basically to party, but they would bring with them this kind of gravity or this kind of vortex of sort of high modernist or post painterly abstraction or whatever. So anyway, where I was from was actually quite imbued with this ethos of color field painting and whatnot growing up. But then when I went to Amsterdam, I realized there was this whole history within modernism, that we were kind of getting something from the New York school and getting a kind of an
Mhm.
American understanding of it, but there was this other history. So a lot of the works that I was sort of making reference to relate more to the sort of roots of abstraction, rather than its kind of the way it sprouted up in places like Saskatoon, but actually thinking about how abstraction sort of grew out of some of the not necessarily malaise, but kind of the that millennial strange time in Europe, uh,
Mhm.
with the schools like Bauhaus and all the others that were really trying to link craft and intuition and process and the hand into this kind of like creating this new way of thinking about work. So it really was in Europe for me that I started to think about the question of modern painting
Mhm.
from that lens. Um, it's a bit of a hard leap to go from that to the painting that's up there, but in shorthand, basically what happened with me is I did that show where where you saw those sculptures on the floor and
Yeah.
then textiles on the wall and then little paintings. And basically what happened was I was sort of triangulating my position in relation to sculpture and textiles and painting. But then in the last sort of large scale show I had recently at Clint Rowenish
Yeah.
in Toronto,
Mhm.
uh, I called that show The Valley of Love, and it was basically like returning to painting
Mhm.
after 15 years or so of really just sort of unraveling all these different threads. And
Yeah.
then in that show, it was really kind of like thinking about what I could say with painting, and they were large scale works. And in that show I started to think about painting as telling stories, and painting as kind of crafting this narrative, creating a kind of a space almost like a folk tale, like you're
Yeah.
riffing on a tale that's being told thousands and thousands of times. It's the
Yeah.
same story, but you're kind of telling it in a new way. So the way I would make those paintings was I would start with a small watercolor that
Okay.
would
And let me
often be
just
based on
move
something. Yeah.
ahead because I have a
Mhm.
few different things lined up here. So we'll just kind of move out of order. Let's start with a watercolor like this in terms of this is maybe for a newer body of work, but do you want to talk about,
Mhm.
since you were talking about watercolors and how they play into
Yeah, well, yeah, I would start with something like that was actually an image that I just saw on Instagram, like an image of a forest,
hmm
and then I made a drawing of it first, and then
hmm
I made a painting of that drawing, and then from that little thing, which is about 9 by 12 inches or something like that, I would blow that up to large scale, like 9 feet or 8 feet tall, and then in the process of bringing it forward, the image would kind of break down or fall apart. Like I would intentionally sort of like do things to the canvas to make myself lose the image, like to there would be this kind of architecture or a map, but then I often stain the canvas to
hmm
the point where it almost becomes unrecognizable, and then I have to rebuild it. So it was sort of like this idea of a folk tale was you have this very common, almost banal kind of subject that you use as an architecture or kind of a roadmap, and then in the process of painting, something new may or may not, like sometimes they don't work, you know. Sometimes I'll work on a really large painting and it's, you know, a month goes or 2 months goes into it and you realize you're not getting anywhere with it.
Yeah.
And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll get to a certain page, like the one that you're showing, I'll get to a certain point and I'll pour sand into the wet paint, which
hmm
kind of totally obliterates the image.
Right.
And then
So
from
just to
there,
give
I'll
people
work
a
back
sense
again.
of things, what we're talking about is something like in here, you can see that this is actually is sand. You want to just describe that for people for sort of 1 second so they kind of know?
Yeah, well, that's literally sand embedded in wet oil paint. And because it's a large painting, you know, something like 60 inches tall, you
hmm
have to work really fast because the paint will, you know, it dries at different times.
hmm
So at that last stage that you see there, that kind of creamy beige, that
hmm
kind of mole hair color, that would have been me painting out all of the negative space, like all of the space in between things with
Yeah.
a certain color, like red, and then covering the whole entire painting with sand so that
Yeah.
it adheres to that, and then waiting for it to dry and staining it. I'll usually cover it with another layer or something so that the sand becomes, you know, more saturated.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's a perfect example of or this one that you have up
Yeah. This
currently.
is in our current show,
Basically,
and I'll apologize to people only to tell them that this is a little bit darker than the painting really is. So just kind of bear with that. But go ahead, please.
well, yeah, like that one. I think I've got. I don't know. It might just be sitting here. Let me see if it's. Yeah, here it is. I this is quite simple. I was in the backyard with my son,
Oh,
and
nice.
we saw a little. I saw a little bush back there. I made the drawing, and I knew
Yeah.
that the drawing was just a very simple kind of response to being in on the patio with my
Yeah.
son. But then from there, it's like the paint. So I had a kind of a structure to start with, but then like I said, I'll paint and then I'll cover the painting with a color like yellow, and then redo it in color like blue and then red, and like just keep kind of pushing it until the initial impulse just sort of disappears and something new. It's a little bit like with the portraits, like there's
Yeah.
something there at the beginning, but then you lose that, and a new thing kind of emerges.
Well, maybe we could go
And
back.
that, go
Oh,
ahead.
go ahead. I was just going to say we could go back to the portraits really quick and kind of take a look at those, if that is a good
Sure,
place to
sure.
be. So we have a lot of images here and some great stuff to see. As a preview to the portraits, I actually, and of course we want to talk about the textiles too and your sense of color, but I started with this image.
Yeah. Well, that's a new one. That one is actually a bit of an not a, I wouldn't say it's an anomaly, but there's a huge question mark for me, because usually what I would do is I would have a very simple structure and then just keep working the hell out of it, you know,
In a
like even
painting
with my
like this,
watercolors.
like this one, for example.
Yeah, like just
Yeah.
paint and paint, and it's not like I'm not it's not like I'm fetishizing the labor, or that I'm so convinced by my own process or something. It's quite the
I'm
opposite. It's
convinced
like,
by your process.
well, it's kind of the opposite of that in the sense that it's usually I'm not finding it. Like I'm trying. It's like if you see them earlier on, they kind of look terrible. Like they're
Yeah.
not there. But then at some point, with the portraits, for example, a kind of our personality emerges. But with that one that you just showed, the watercolor, that this was done in a very immediate way. So like
Yeah.
from start to finish in 10 minutes or something.
Dude,
Like
that's ridiculous. That just makes me
like,
so, as a failed painter, that makes me so jealous.
well, yeah. So I don't know what's happening with these, because I have a hunch that maybe the kind of extreme, like the overworking thing has become maybe a little bit of a crutch. And so with this one, it was like, what would happen if I didn't go back on any of the moves? Like every move was just done once, and then you let it go. So so that was kind of like almost like calligraphy or something, in that you're just trying to just respond. But yeah,
Let's
so this is I would
qualify.
say this was a bit of an anomaly.
Let's qualify the term overworking, just so people have a sense of sort of what you mean by that. Obviously, it's in quotes a little bit, and you're being a little facetious, but we've talked a little bit about someone like Giacometti, for example. So when Giacometti's making these paintings, or when he's making his sculptures, my understanding, and I'm obviously not an art historian, is that in a lot of ways his figures become increasingly smaller as he makes the painting. And there's this great idea of finding the painting in the painting. That's a wonderful idea that I think expresses what it's like to be standing in front of a canvas, trying to get it to go somewhere. And then at a certain point, you start following the cues you see that the canvas is bringing back to you, or the sculpture. So in Giacometti's case, these pictures, which have these tiny little people, in a way, they started big, and then he like works them back. This is what I've read. That was my understanding of David Sylvester's interpretation of the work, what I read. I could be totally wrong. And also his sculpture. So in a painting like this, you were talking a little bit about earlier, before we talk now, about how, you kind of have you start with an image of a person, and then they kind of like lock into place as you push these parts around. Is that a correct synopsis?
Yeah, and I think to recalibrate what I meant by overworking was literally working it till it's dead, but then finding a way to make it alive, like not letting it die, like actually sort of finding the thing within it, so that it, like it's a corollary might be someone like Frank Auerbach, in that it's so incredibly frustrating to hear him talk and to see his work, because the painting will look amazing right off, like it'll look amazing, but he'll keep working on it for a year and a half, and it's just like but so it's not as though you're settling for overworking a painting. It's actually, in his case, for example, you want the painting to sort of emerge, even though you painted the same painting 300 times in his case, or something like that. When the final thing happens, it happens all at once. It's kind of a magical, and I'm looking for that too. Like I want the whole thing to look like it's happening. Like, for example, if you look at a mountain, like a mountain, a rock face, or actually when you look at a human, you don't look at a human and go, oh, that's interesting. You have a cheek and a canine tooth and an ear and hair. Like you see you see something that it's total. There's a totality, right? So I've got all these constituent parts, all these little sort of like separated fragments that are very much sort of painterly moments, but I want the thing to come at you in like a breath, like just one complete opening. I don't want it to look like a composite of many, many, many things. So the idea of working it is just to get to that stage where it looks like it's happening in an instant, and it looks kind of fresh, and sort of it's something surprises me when I'm making it, like something kind of, and usually that happens when I'll do something radical, like paint over the painting, like just cover it with another color and then bring it forward, and then I can sort of stop. In that case, this is from that's a painting called Aldous Harding, because there's this really fantastic musician from New Zealand, and when she plays music, she's performing like she's doing all these crazy sort of clown-like weird vaudeville type gestures. And so the idea of the gesture, the idea of the personality, the persona, is something that she is doing in her music. So I I made a portrait of her.
Well, this is an
But
amazing
again,
painting. I mean, you talked before about Philip Taft, and when I saw some of your other pieces, they remind me of Mondrian's
mhm,
tree studies right before the abstraction kind of starts later. And this figure, it's like they have this tree structure almost built into their face, or you pointed out the faceting of like where a cheek or a canine goes. And I think also what
mhm,
you're saying is super interesting with regard to, obviously, you have the idea of abstract expressionism, which is an idea that people think about people like Greenberg, but of course another person was Harold Rosenberg, whose term was action
mhm,
painting. And
mhm.
those are both
And
ideas
the flatbed.
the arena of painting as a place
Mhm,
for action. And as you're talking about it too, somehow I was thinking about Jay DeFeo and how The Rose, this amazing painting that she made, like took her like 10 years, and she, in theory, went through like the Baroque, the Rococo. Like she said, she went through every style of the work, and it had this massive pile of paint underneath it that became like almost a performance space for people like
mhm,
Bruce Conner and stuff, because she was like living inside this painting. And anyway, when they
mhm,
cut in the back of that from the Whitney, there was even still wet paint inside and jewelry and all kinds of stuff.
mhm.
This is a beautiful watercolor that you sent to me, that I think is just gorgeous. And you talked a lot about connections between the U.S. and Canada in terms of Emma Lake, but of course there's other interesting connections. People, there's American artists that famously went to places like Nova Scotia and the school there, or were in
Mhm.
Vancouver and connected with people there. But then I also think about Canadian artists who, like, potters in British Columbia that studied at St. Ives. And of course, you mentioned this in terms of Canada as this very interesting, very different history than the United States. I mean, we're contiguous with one another and we have a shared history, but at the same time, Canada has so many other influences. And one of the things you mentioned was kind of Scandinavian painting as it kind of flowed through things, and that feeling. I was thinking about Munch or other figures in terms of a sense of what the landscape means. And you touched on this a little bit with regard to urban spaces. Do you want to talk a little bit about landscape and perhaps even some of the stories that you were kind of referring to earlier?
Yeah. Um, well, the history of painting is, one of those things. It's like a sort of a badge of honor that painters wear, but it's also kind of a badge of shame. Like it's kind of like so freighted and so um, encumbered,
Mhm.
and you know there's no, I don't think anyway personally, actually I shouldn't say that, there's a kind of a new generation of young painters that have a different relation to it. But from my growing, when I went to school,
Yeah, no,
we were almost, it's like self-flagellating. You had to sort of do penance
yeah.
or something in order to be a painter. You had to prove how sorry
Oh, yeah.
how shame and how much shame and how much sorrow you had in order, before you were allowed to approach it. I don't know exactly why that was, but there was something about moving away from, well, exactly those artists that I was talking about, like moving away from the legacy of Greenbergian modernism and all of that into something that was much more kind of aware of gender and aware of the history of the relationship of power that
Yeah.
has always existed in the way we think about culture.
Yeah, I think
Anyway.
that certain kinds of, I mean, I think this is one of the things that's incredibly exciting right now, is that this sort of clear feeling of art history, particularly as it was taught to those of us like myself who are in our late 40s. There's so much kind of power and white hegemony in terms of thinking about some of the minimalist trajectory that we were talked about. And obviously I'm a white male and the most entitled person in American society, but it's been revelatory for me to be learning things and thinking about and learning new artists and seeing how things that I was taught were freighted with all of these things. And I think one of the things with regard to painting is that painting is a medium that has this incredible history that we're also seeing and just really enjoying artists that I really, to be honest, didn't know about. And it's absolutely
Hmm.
changed my sense of the medium, and particularly changed my sense of figuration and landscape and some of these other things. So
Yeah, yeah, well, for sure. Like, I mean, I think it has to be kind of,
I'm just going to
um,
enjoy this painting a little bit because we got some great.
sure. It has to be kind of like, there has to be some recognition of the way in which, so when I was going to school, for example, in the 90s, it was very much a kind of unraveling and a kind of
Yeah,
deconstruction, a kind of, thinking about those issues around hegemony and around whatever patriarchy and sort of the domination of certain figures within the history especially within modern art. It's interesting for me though, because a lot of my teachers were women, and
hmm,
Janet Werner, who's a really fantastic painter. I think she's one of the best painters in the country. Anyways, she just so happened she had just graduated from Yale, and she teaches in Montreal now. But at the time, she was teaching in this little town in Saskatchewan. So I had her as my prof, and she was acutely aware of a lot of these issues. But anyway, that's the reason I'm bringing that up, is because when you talk about the Nordic painters, or the,
hmm,
in Canada we have like the Group of Seven or the landscape. Like, these are all things that are very, they come with this, like I said before, very freighted kind of history. And so for me, these newest paintings are kind of, as I mentioned, this show called The Valley of Love, I had these large kind of narrative paintings going on. One was a city,
hmm,
one was a garden. That's the one that was a city.
hmm,
This one is called The Boarding House. And it
hmm.
was sort of this idea of a built, like a structure, and then another structure kind of built on top, and then another structure, like almost like you're renovating a house and you keep adding rooms to the house. So it was a bit of an allegory in a way for the idea of painting
Yeah,
as being in this inherited or borrowed space. Uh, and one was the forest, that it was called The Clearing, and one was a huge portrait of a kind of a hippie guy.
yeah,
Um, so anyway, my interest in landscape has always been there from the very beginning, but these new paintings are kind of like, um, using the structure or the motif of the landscape in the same way I'm using the structure of a face, or in the same way I'm using the structure of a flower. Like, it's really a motif. It's a kind of an archetype or an architecture, and within that, I try to sort of look for a way of coming at it. I wouldn't say coming at it fresh, because my paintings are actually quite, um, they're very much rooted in this kind of language or history, but coming at it in my own way. Oh, and the important thing, I don't know if there's any artists that have logged on to this.
I think
I'm assuming there should be a few out
yeah,
there, but the thing for me about that was, this wasn't something that I preconceived. Like, it's
yeah,
not like I had this plan to do this. It was sort of like this emerged through my own, like, as I was working, I was trying to let go of certain ways of working. So the landscapes that you showed here are coming out of that process of kind of letting go. Whereas if you go back even further into my history, you'll see these big landscapes that are like photorealistic.
yeah,
They were just like every single branch and every single leaf was painted, and they took me forever, and they were rooted in photography.
yeah,
Whereas these ones they're kind of improvised. I'm kind of figuring out the structure as I go along. I'm kind of making the composition as the painting is coming into focus. So the reason I'm saying that is because I think it's, for me, that was like a really, it took me 20 years of working to get to that stage where I could let go of a kind of, the scaffolding of an image, and
yeah,
just let the kind of thing happen in a kind of open way. So those flowers and paintings like that, those are all improvised. They're just
yeah,
me kind of playing with shapes and form.
yeah. So it's been about half an hour, so we usually kind of ring off here. This is the painting again in the National Gallery in Ontario, in their permanent collection, in their show there. Is there anything further that you would want to say to anybody before we sign off, Scott?
Well, just I'm grateful to have this opportunity to be in such a fantastic gallery with such fantastic artists, and
Nice.
it's a new kind of vista for me, a new threshold. I'm really happy about having that conversation. A lot of the artists that I'm in a kind of conversation with, sort of, as colleagues, are in the States. A lot of my friends living in New York or living in Los Angeles, or Chicago. So I'm really happy to have the opportunity to kind of branch out into a bit of a new audience.
Mm.
I've got a show coming up in a couple of weeks, actually, in Germany, and so I'll make sure to send images along about that. And then, and I'm really excited about the show in Los Angeles in January.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be a really wonderful opportunity for me to continue this and to sort of push it even further.
Well, that's great. I couldn't be happier working with you. I'm really delighted that we're going to get to do the show in January. We have some great pieces on view. We are open by appointment here in LA. If you want to come to the space, just send us an email and you get a 1-hour private appointment where we close the gallery for you, and you wipe down before you come. Everyone wears masks. If you have any questions about anything that you saw today, just feel free to send me an email. I want to also thank Clint Robish, who introduced me to the work, his amazing partner, who's Sky's Gallerist in Toronto, who's amazing and has been really fantastic to work with thus far. And so, again, I just want to thank everyone for joining us and being here to share in this today. And Sky, thank you so much for being so generous and giving us some thoughts with regard to your practice. I really appreciate it. This was super fun.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, my man. See you around.
Okay. See you.